The original Tacoma Narrows Bridge was opened for traffic on July 1, 1940. The suspension bridge spanned over a mile and had a unique, slender design. The bridge quickly became nicknamed Galloping Gertie because it experienced large up and down movement on windy days. On the morning of November 7, 1940, the movement of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge changed from the usual longitudinal motion to a never-before-seen twisting mode. The peak twisting motion of the roadbed is estimated to have been 25 feet from crest to valley. The bridge was closed to traffic due to the unsafe conditions. The violent twisting motion continued to increase for about an hour until the suspender cables snapped and 600 feet of the roadbed was dropped into Puget Sound below. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was destroyed a little more than 4 months after it opened. During the collapse, the main suspension cables were thrown violently side to side, twisted, and tossed 100 feet into the air. They slipped from their positions in the cable saddles atop each tower. And they fell hard on the approach spans. On the north cable at mid-span, where the cable band loosened, it broke more than 350 wires. Other wires were severely stressed and distorted. The main cables were a total loss, but salvage was undertaken. The violent collapse broke many suspender cables. Some were lost, some severely damaged, and some undamaged. The main towers, including the bracing struts, were twisted and bent. Stress beyond the elastic limit of the metal resulted in buckling and permanent distortion. Not surprisingly, the concrete and steel of the center span that now lay on the bottom of the Narrows was deemed a total loss. The remainder of the broken concrete on the side spans needed removal. The floor system had sections that were bent and overstressed. The loss of the center section, followed by the dropping of the side spans, caused substantial damage. The events stressed and distorted the plate girders and floor beams. Some buckled beyond repair. The anchorages for the main cables were undamaged. For building a replacement bridge, removal of part of the concrete would be necessary in order to spin the new main cables. The collapse of the 1940 Tacoma Narrows Bridge stunned everyone, especially engineers. How could the most modern suspension bridge, with the most advanced design, suffer catastrophic failure in a relatively light wind? The state of Washington, the insurance companies, and the United States government appointed boards of experts to investigate the collapse of the Narrows Bridge. The Federal Works Administration, FWA, appointed a 3-member panel of top-ranking engineers, Othmar Ammann, Dr. Theodore von Karman, and Glenn B. Woodruff. Their report was the administrator of the FWA, John Carmody, and became known as the Carmody Board Report. In March 1941, the Carmody Board announced its findings. In Genre the report said that random turbulent wind caused the bridge to fail. This ambiguous explanation was the beginning of attempts to understand the complex phenomenon of wind-induced motion in suspension bridges. The principal cause of the 1940 Narrows Bridge's failure was its excessive flexibility. The solid plate girder and deck acted like an aerofoil, creating drag and lift. Aerodynamic forces were little understood, and engineers needed to test suspension bridge designs using models in a wind tunnel. The fundamental weakness of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, said a summary article published in Engineering News Record, was its great flexibility, vertically and in torsion. Several factors contributed to the excessive flexibility. The deck was too light. The deck was too shallow at 8 feet. The side spans were too long, compared with the length of the center span. The cables were anchored at too great a distance from the side spans. The width of the deck was extremely narrow compared with its center span length, an unprecedented ratio of 1:72. The pivotal event in the bridge's collapse, said the board, was the change from vertical waves to the destructive twisting, torsional motion. This event was associated with the slippage of the cable band on the north cable at midspan. Normally, the main cables are of equal length where the midspan cable band attaches them to the deck. When the band slipped, the north cable became separated into two segments of unequal length. The imbalance translated quickly to the thin, flexible plate girders, which twisted easily. Once the unbalanced motion began, progressive failure followed. The investigation board's most significant finding was simple and obvious: the engineering community must study and better understand aerodynamics in designing long suspension bridges. For over 6 decades, engineers have studied the collapse of the 1940 Tacoma Narrows Bridge. The experts disagree, at least on some aspects of the explanation. A definitive description that meets unanimous agreement has not been reached. The exact cause of the bridge's failure remains a mystery. In general, the bridge had relatively little resistance to torsional forces. That was because it had such a large depth-to-width ratio, 1:72. Girdy's long, narrow, and shallow stiffening girder made the structure extremely flexible. On the morning of November 7, 1940, shortly after 10 a.m., a critical event occurred. The cable band at midspan on the north cable slipped. This allowed the cable to separate into two unequal segments. That contributed to the change from vertical to torsional movement of the bridge deck. Also contributing to the torsional motion of the bridge deck was vortex shedding. U.S. moneylenders blamed by engineers for span crash. That headline appeared in the Tacoma Times on November 9, 1940, 2 days after the collapse of Galloping Girdy. When reporters asked lead project engineer Clark Eldridge to explain why the Narrows Bridge collapsed, he could not hold back. He was angry. Eldridge told the newspapers, "The men who held the purse strings were the whip crackers on the entire project. We had a tried and true conventional bridge design. We were told we couldn't have the necessary money without using plans furnished by an Eastern firm of engineers, chosen by the money lenders." Eldridge and other state engineers had protested Leon Moiseev's design with its 8-foot solid girders, which he called sails. But it was no use. Public Works Administration officials said they knew nothing about a problem with the bridge's design. Soon, however, one of their own engineers broke the truth to the newspapers and the public. 2 months later, the scandal again made headlines. Bridge expose breaks bannered the Tacoma Times on January 11, 1941. This time, it became public that the PWA's own engineer had refused to approve the bridge when it was completed in July 1940. David L. Glenn, the PWA's field engineer on site in Tacoma, submitted a report warning of faults in design and refusing to recommend acceptance of the structure. But, the PWA accepted the bridge. So did the Washington State Toll Bridge Authority. In March 1941, the Carmody Board announced its findings. The principal cause of the Narrows Bridge's failure was its flexibility. The solid plate girder and deck acted like an airfoil, creating drag and lift, and the aerodynamic forces were little understood, and engineers needed to test all suspension bridge designs thoroughly using models in a wind tunnel. The board refused to blame any one person. The entire engineering profession was responsible, said the experts. The Carmody Board's report contained a statement by the Acting Commissioner of Public Works, J. Madigan, explaining the selection of consulting engineers for the Tacoma Narrows Bridge project. It included the following statement: "In no instance did this administration nominate, or express any preference for any particular individual, group, or firm." Clark Eldridge had a very different opinion. In his autobiography, Eldridge bluntly declares that Moisseiff and the consulting firm of Moran and Proctor associated themselves to secure the commission to design the Tacoma Bridge. They went to Washington, called on the Public Works Administration and informed them that they could design a structure here that could be built for not more than $7 million. So when Highway Director Lacey Murrow appeared asking for $11 million, our estimate, he was told $7 million was all they would approve. They suggested that he confer with Mr. Moisseiff and Moran and Proctor. This he did, ending up employing them to direct a new design. Othmar Ammann, a leading bridge engineer and member of the Federal Works Agency Commission investigating the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, wrote that the Tacoma Narrows Bridge failure has given us invaluable information. It has shown that every new structure that projects into new fields of magnitude involves new problems for the solution of which neither theory nor practical experience furnish an adequate guide. It is then that we must rely largely on judgment, and if, as a result, errors or failures occur, we must accept them as a price for human progress. Which raises the question: are errors or failures an acceptable price for human progress in all instances? Are they really acceptable where there is a serious risk to life and/or of great financial loss?